So Anna and I are finally back from our trip to New York and D.C. We've been gone for 4 or 5 days, and lo and behold, the Republicans are still bitching about the debate rules. I feel like we didn't actually leave. Days couldn't have passed because they're still talking about it. This time, it's Ted Cruz, and he wants control over who gets to moderate the debates, which you're going to see in this clip.
I have suggested a very, very simple rule. How about the moderators of Republican primaries actually be Republicans? If you have individuals who have never in their life voted in a Republican primary, maybe they shouldn't be moderating Republican primaries. I've suggested, how about a Republican primary moderated by Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin? Now, I guarantee you would get incredible ratings for that. I'd love to see that primary. I think a whole lot of people would. How about bringing in people like Glenn Beck? How about bringing in Hugh Hewitt and letting him actually ask real and substantive questions? There are a host of strong conservatives you could bring in that would engage, and we're not talking about pussycat questions. We're not talking about easy questions. We're talking about questions that are relevant to what a Republican primary voter is trying to decide.
We're talking about questions that'll allow us to spout out our talking points with absolutely no challenges or follow-up questions.
Well, actually, see, that's the thing. I actually think if they were to do what he's saying, if they were to bring in Glenn Beck and Rush Limbaugh, I think that they could get the sort of debate you're talking about with some people. There's certainly those people. But I think that Glenn Beck would actually have a meltdown. I think that he would actually ask insane questions, not actually productive questions. But I don't think that he would launch pussycat questions. I think he would ask questions about conspiracy theories and the end of the world and stuff like that. I think it would be a shit show, I think.
The debates are already a shit show.
Rush Limbaugh hates half of them.
Look, the incredible thing is the debates that they've had to deal with so far haven't even given them any hardball questions, right? Like the CNN GOP debate, for instance, where all they did was just pit one person against one another. Like, oh, they were just the instigator, right? So, hey, Donald Trump said this about you. What do you think, Ben Carson? You know, and they just get into a ridiculous high school type fight.
Yeah.
They haven't had to deal with any hardcore questions. Like, first of all, here's what shouldn't happen in a democracy, okay? You shouldn't have political candidates or politicians in general having any type of editorial control in the world of journalism, okay? That is ridiculous. I mean, they talk about state-run journalism or state-run media in countries like China, and oh my God, it's terrible, it's authoritarian, it's this and that. That's what you're trying to do. So you can get your talking points across, so you can get your propaganda across to the audience. You're supposed to be challenged. You're not supposed to be questioned by people who agree with everything you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that if they were to have, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a strong liberal on TV. It's going to take a while, so I'm just going to say Joe, whoever Joe is. If he was a strong liberal and they were to bring him in to moderate a Republican debate, I think that would be very valuable to the candidates and especially to the party because it would show them something like what the Democratic candidate is going to challenge them on when they finally become the actual nominee. And they would be able to see ahead of time, can this person actually stand up under pressure? And so to that extent, I think it would be valuable to them. Now, I don't think that they're going to do it. And I honestly think that so long as the primary debates are going to be run by the parties, I get that they should be able to choose who it is. I think that the idea that CNBC hosts are these crazy libs, I think that's absurd to everybody who's not a Glenn Beck supporter. But I think that they should be able to largely choose who they want. But I do think that by doing that, they are hurting themselves.
Hold on. You think they should be able to choose who the moderators are?
I'm saying the party. If it's going to be the party that's actually running the debates, then yeah, the party is going to. They're spending millions of dollars so that they can make their candidates look good and choose the right one.
That's crazy, though. Then our entire system is broken.
Well, but they do already choose who the moderators are.
I know, and that's crazy. I think it's crazy that they get to choose who the moderators are, and I think it's even crazier that they want even more control over the debates. The debates are not supposed to be a beauty pageant for the Republicans, okay? The debates are supposed to give us an idea of what their policies are, right?
But so long as they're run by the parties, they're not. They are sort of beauty pageants. What I'm saying is that you can change that system. It doesn't have to be simply, like right now we say, what's the debate schedule? Well, it's what the RNC and the DNC says it's going to be. But there's nothing stopping anyone from putting on a debate. If Ben Carson and Donald Trump wanted to just hang out on the beach and talk on Periscope for 2 hours, they could do it. Like there's nothing stopping them from doing it. It's just that we just assume that it's going to be the parties that are running it. And as long as it's the parties, they have ulterior motives. They're going to set it up as a beauty pageant.
It's incredible how much control politicians have over the media. It's depressing because we don't get, of course we don't get the truth. You guys already understand that. But they want more control, and they're not supposed to have it. They're not supposed to decide who the moderators are. I understand that they're already doing it, but the fact that they still have a choice and it's still not good enough for them, they want even more editorial control. They were talking they were talking about specific things that they would change in the debate coverage, and one thing that they wanted control over was the graphics as they were speaking. So I guess the tickers that the the networks will run as the candidates are talking. All those tickers do is reiterate what the candidates have been saying during the debate. They want control over that. Why? If you don't like what the tickers are saying, then stop answering like an idiot.
Yeah, say something different.
Right. It's incredible. They don't want to take
the graphics.
This is the party that constantly talks about responsibility, right? Take responsibility for your actions. You get pregnant and you don't want to get pregnant. No abortion for you because you got to take responsibility for your actions. You're poor, you have no money to pay for food for your family. Take responsibility for your actions. And they don't want to take responsibility for their own policy ideas. They want to hide behind the media like this, and it's pathetic.
If you don't want your tax plan to be mocked as unrealistic and unable to actually fund government operations, don't set it at a level where it clearly can't fund government operations.
And some of them don't even have policy ideas. Trump doesn't have policy ideas. Ben Carson doesn't have policy ideas. Neither one of them have any real concrete solution to any of the problems that they're constantly bringing up. And they have the audacity to say that they're upset with the way that these debates are moderated because they don't get to talk about their policy ideas. You don't have policy ideas.
They're pussycats.
You don't.
They're pussycats.
They're dummies.
They're dummies. Okay, so Cruz was talking with Megyn Kelly, a member of the media that he despises so much. And let's see if he sticks to his guns on his proposed change in this video.
My attitude is that I'm happy to debate any of the candidates anytime and anywhere.
A few moments later.
You know, the one point that I have made, and I've made it several times, is why is it that we have Republican primary debates that are moderated by liberal Democrats? And the one rule change that I think the RNC ought to think about is saying that if you have never in your life voted in a Republican Party primary, that you shouldn't be moderating a Republican primary debate.
I love Megyn Kelly's just like the whole time. She blinked a couple times. The rest of her face didn't actually move.
At one point, her mouth was like her jaw was dropped. Like,
exactly. Yeah. She's like, you idiot. Anyway, she actually has a good response to it, which you're going to see in this clip.
Let me challenge you on that. Do you have any idea whether Brett Baier or Chris Wallace have ever voted in a Republican primary?
I have no idea, and I'm guessing you may tell me whether Megyn Kelly has.
So neither do I. I have no idea, but I can tell you as a fact that those are two of the most fair, talented journalists in the business. So under your rule, they could potentially be excluded from anchoring a presidential debate.
Look, they could potentially. My guess is that they have voted in a Republican primary. I can certainly tell you that Chris Wallace and Brett Baier and Megyn Kelly are not liberals. And the reality is that most journalists at mainstream media stations are liberal Democrats.
But how would it work? Would we have to submit our voting records to you or some committee? I mean, we'd have to prove what primaries we voted in or didn't. Like, how would that really be impracticality?
It's not complicated. In a primary, don't have liberals moderating. How
what
about
Tim Russert? He was a liberal. Obviously, you know, when Russert was alive, he was one of the most respected journalists. You wouldn't sit for a debate moderated by Tim Russert?
Megyn, why not have, and listen, I'm happy to debate in front of anybody.
Right,
I go
this
on
is your
MSNBC.
forte.
He's so happy that a week and a half after the debate, he's still bringing up all the changes he wants to make to it. It is astounding the level of weakness, the fear of being questioned, the fear of having to expound on your ideas, to give details, to give specifics. And like you said, the party of responsibility, they're also supposedly the party of strength. They're the party of national defense. They're the party that's going to stand between you and Russian tanks. But they can't stand between themselves and a tough question.
It's incredible. You shouldn't be afraid of tough questions if you know that your policy ideas make sense, that they're right. But here's the thing. The majority of them don't have policy ideas. They've just created a career on attacking Democratic policy proposals, okay? And also, they don't have popular opinions. They really don't. When you think about what they want to do to things like Social Security and Medicare and all these programs that people desperately need or really, really like, I mean, they're going to be obliterated in the elections if they go out there and they say what they truly believe.
If the media actually ends up letting people know what they actually believe.
Exactly. And oftentimes that doesn't happen because they already have a tremendous amount of control over the media. And really, you're going to talk to me about the media being liberal? The media is liberal.
They will, yeah.
It's incredible.
It's incredible. Now, thankfully, as much as most of these candidates hate the current debates, they also largely hate each other more. And so a number have signed on saying that they will not sign on to the letter that Ben Carson's campaign largely wants to send out, laying out their expectations for future debates. Jeb's campaign, Paul, Christie, Cruz, Fiorina, Kasich, and actually Trump will not sign it. Trump, the biggest whining baby of them all, in the end actually isn't going to sign on to the letter because he, again, wants to see the world burn more than he wants to avoid tough questions, which is good. I saw he was tweeting earlier today that Megyn Kelly hadn't used a poll that showed that he was up over Carson. She tweeted back showing a screenshot where she had actually used it. They're just such babies. They're such babies.
There's a lot of whining. But here's the thing. What do Democrats plan on doing about China? Because Trump wants to know. Tough guy Trump, who can't handle tough questions.
And Webb.
Yeah.
The South China Sea.
Yeah.
What's your plan?
What is your plan? Okay.
We may never know.
I haven't heard a single Democrat whine and cry about moderators or questions being too tough. Anytime you hear about so-called gotcha journalism, it's some dumb Republican who can't handle a simple question.
Yeah.
Sarah Palin, Ben Carson,
Donald Trump.
Candidates that have no political history, no real political experience, no policy ideas, and no brain cells to rub together.
Yeah. Yeah, when you hear them refer to questions like what newspapers do you read, what's your favorite Bible verse, and they say it's a gotcha question, think very briefly, could you, someone not running for the presidency, answer the question? You could? Then they should be able to probably answer it too. That seems fair to me.